Good evening. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of the Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And well, thank you, Howard. And I'm so pleased to welcome you all here, both online and in person, to really what is going to be a very special lecture on Irving Berlin. In addition to having a gifted speaker this evening, I'm also want to express our huge gratitude to our musicians providing musical accompaniment, and that is a violinist, Gregory Singer, and the pianist, Juliana Ruckman. And indeed, bravo, our in-person audience had an opportunity to hear some of their wonderful music. And you, our online audience, will have an opportunity to hear them during the program and then at the conclusion of the program. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, a brief introduction. We are a non-profit organization that was originally founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, our 238-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs, including our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, of course, of which the in-person audience is here tonight, the John M. Mossman Locke Museum that you can see above, and finally, our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which tonight is part of. For the online audience, please feel free to submit type questions at any point during the program. For our in-person audience, we ask that you hold off on questions until the conclusion of the program. I'm so pleased to be able to welcome tonight Paul Kaplan back to the General Society this evening. We've been fortunate enough to have Paul speak here twice before. Paul will be discussing his latest book, Irving Berlin, From Penniless Immigrant to America's Songwriter. Paul writes under 3 series: Cultural Guides, Social History, and Biographies, and Business Technology Marketing, with 7 published books from History Press, Pelican, and Quill Driver Books. He has given over 70 talks globally for numerous venues. He's been featured on CBS Miami, PBS, New York Press, Amsterdam, New York, Princeton Magazine, and many radio shows. Paul has worked in content marketing for 20+ years for financial and technology companies. I want to mention that his wonderful book, which I have forgotten to have up and holding in my hand at this very moment, but is going to be available for sale tonight. Paul will be doing a book signing at the conclusion of the program, and also our online audience can purchase it online. It is now my huge pleasure to introduce to you Paul Kaplan.
All right, terrific. So it is great to see all of you in person and online. I think that we are going to have a lot of fun tonight. We're going to learn a little bit more about Irving Berlin and have some music accompaniment as well. So just want to first start off by thanking Karen and her staff and Victoria and Angelo here at the library for everything that they do and all the work that they do. And again, to thank our musicians for really supplementing this. So that's fantastic. So let me kind of give you a lay of the land here. So we're going to talk about Berlin's life. At an overview, the book goes into a little more depth. We'll more emphasize the first 55 years, let's say. I'll play some original audio recordings. And we really tried to get, you hear the scratchy tone of it, which would be kind of fun. Some videos and film clips. And we'll look at some larger questions. So not just the life, but what is the role of a songwriter in this? And how about shifting technology, which has always been a story with music or entertainment? How did that impact things? And, like I said, we'll have some musical entertainment afterwards, and a little during, and then we'll have some Q&A and do some book signings and I think some late refreshments, and that'll be the event, okay? All right. So let's kind of jump into it. I think some of you know that for Irving Berlin, who was Israel Baline, living as a baby until he was 5 years old in the Pale of Settlement in Russia. And as many of you know, there were pogroms at that time. So villages were burned down commonly, and his was. So there's an anecdote of a horseman burning down houses, and he remembers as a small child, like some of the screams. And his father, who was sort of a cantor, decided to go to America, as many did. That was a very common sentiment. So I have some quotes for you, so you kind of don't just hear me speaking, but hear from people at the time. So a young Russian at the time wrote, "People who had relatives in the famous land went around reading their letters for the enlightenment of the less fortunate folks. All talked about coming to America, but scarcely anyone knew one true fact about this magic land." So a lot of them kind of had I would say like a certain reality check when they came, as it wasn't always what they thought that it would be. So they met their cousin and settled in a dark apartment on Monroe Street. And there was sort of like a culture shock. Everybody could scream here and no one cared because everybody was taking part in that. For Antwerp and inspected at Ellis Island. And then they met their cousins and they settled around Cherry Street. So he was called Israel Baline. And he first learns his love of music with his father as sort of a makeshift cantor. So in the Lower East Side. So the father worked as like a butcher, or not a butcher, but like a kind of a kosher inspector. But sometimes it's interesting in a biography to think, where did someone get their inspiration? Where did they learn that from? And in this case, to a certain extent, hearing his father sing made him sort of interested in music. So Izzy was not much of a student, and he was expected to earn money for his family. And that was very common then. We had another lecture here about a year ago, in New York in the progressive era, and we talked about like child labor and how that was very prominent and a lot of the laws around that. So I think some of you were at that lecture. That relates here because, he went out and eventually left school at a very young age. So he became a newsie, and he realizes that he can sort of differentiate himself by singing. And he noticed that when he sings, he would kind of get more coins tossed at him, or maybe sell more papers. And this sort of like plants the seed a little bit. Like if he could sing well, customers may toss a few coins over at him. So he's just wondering like how all this is going to play out. He gave his earnings to his family, which was the expectation, and started singing songs as like a business kind of and money. So later we're going to talk about what is a songwriter. Is this for social change? Is this more of a commercial songwriter? Without judgment. We're not saying one's better than the other, okay? But in this case, Irving Berlin was a commercial songwriter. I mean, he was very much about figuring out what was popular and delivering on that. And although we'll talk later about how ironically he actually did become so culturally influential. So we'll take a look at that. Okay, Izzy leaves home at age 14, and this was, again, not terribly unusual, and goes to the Bowery Street, which was kind of rough and tumble, much more than Cherry Street. Though it was geographically nearby, it was like a totally different culture, especially for a 14-year-old boy. So he works as a newsie, like I mentioned. A passerby says something which really sticks with him. Says, go down to the Bowery and get some change. They are looking for some good singers there. Get busy. So buskers who would sell show tunes by singing them on the street. That was kind of like how, if you were a producer of a musical, how would you get audiences? How would you get people interested? So one way is that you want buskers to sing the songs, and then people would be like, oh, I want to hear that. I want to come to this musical. So there was like a kind of like a quote, like belt out the verses until the customers know them by heart. So remember the technology, and I know that you all know this, but like we are talking about in the late 19th and early 20th century. So how would you actually listen to music that you were interested in? There was limited phonographs, there was no radio, and customers would basically buy sheet music. That was really the business. You buy the sheet music from like Tin Pan Alley, which had really pretty covers, and we have some in the window here for you to look at. And then a mark of a middle-class home was having a piano and learning the piano. And then you would play it, or if you were lucky enough, maybe you would attend a concert as well. Is everything okay? Okay. Izzy worked in several saloons, and like I mentioned, he learned which songs entertained patrons and earned him more money. He also taught himself the piano. This is a very important point. He never had any musical education. He left school when he was like 14. He basically taught himself how to play the piano in a very limited way, just kind of with the black keys. And then there was like this device later that he got, which was underneath the piano and allowed him to switch keys. But he basically would have a tune in his head. But here's what he did have, which you can't really teach. He had an intuitive feel for rhythm and lyrics in a way that a lot of songwriters don't necessarily have. So he worked at Pelham Cafe in Chinatown, and it's fun to see these places now. If you go to Chinatown now, you can kind of still see where that building was, where he worked. And it was a cafe, and it was usually open at night. So Chinatown was considered this very exotic nightlife. And this is also where I think he picked up the very bad habit of insomnia, because he worked very late. Let's talk a little bit about Tin Pan Alley. And I think a lot of you know that Tin Pan Alley it's on 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. And it was named such probably nicknamed because of the tin pans that were clanking. And it produced much of the music that was heard around the world. It was a global business. So remember, we talked about the sheet music with the beautiful covers, and they would often sell at 5 and dime stores for customers at a pretty low price point. So it was more of a volume game, I would say, to play the piece on home at their piano. So I have some numbers to try to make this more real for you. The song could sell like 600, if a song was successful, it could sell for like 600,000 copies of sheet music at about 9 cents per piece. So you wouldn't really get that much if you're the songwriter, but it was a pretty good business until it wasn't for Tin Pan Alley. So Izzy, right? Because we're calling him Izzy because he's not yet Irving Berlin, just so you don't get confused. He auditions for producers to become a busker, or maybe one day to have his own song published. And the first song that the future Irving Berlin would write is Marie from Sunny Italy. So it's kind of like this overly sentimental, sort of a little farcical song. You would kind of maybe roll your eyes a little bit with it, but you know what? Listeners liked it, especially at this Pelham Cafe. It appealed to a lot of like the different ethnic customers and audiences. So that kind of got his feet wet. And then it was sort of around this time that Izzy, or Israel Baline, became Irving Berlin. I do think that he did it more like because it was more marketable. I mean, there's different theories behind it. Let's just call it for what it was. He did it to be more marketable and to be like, more sort of mainstream America. So he starts writing farcical songs like Sadie Salome Go Home. And it's meant to be like humorous too. So this is about an upright man who finds his girlfriend in a sexually risque production. And it's poking fun also at Richard Strauss's Salome and its scandalous premiere, which was happening. So it's a little bit edgy. It's not just all like old-fashioned kind of music, but it's subtle. It's subtle in the subtext. Well, this one's not that subtle, but this was popularized by, who popularized this song? Anyone want to raise their hand and let us know? What famous? Yeah. Fanny Brace. Thank you, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's what kind of made it became famous. So royalties came in, and Berlin, with some of his royalties, he was able to move in his poor family. He was living in this not good condition, the Lower East Side, into a larger apartment. So let's see if we can.
Sadie Cohen left her happy home to become an actress lady. On the stage she soon became the rage as the only real Salome baby. When she came to town, her sweetheart Mose brought for her around a pretty rose. But he got an awful fright when his Sadie came to sight. He stood up and yelled with all his might, "Don't do that dance, I tell you, Sadie. That's not a business for a lady. Most everybody knows that I'm your loving Mose. Oi, 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 where is your clothes? You'd better go and get your dresses."
So just wanted to give you that sense of it. So a few things to know about that. There's the humor. A lot of you are laughing. He's having fun at this point in his early career. He's not really like that famous yet, but he's having fun with sort of the ethnic part. He's also, like I mentioned about the Richard Strauss, which was a big issue. And so it's sort of farcical, it's humorous. Now this one, which we don't, you can look it up later online, I recommend, but this one is Pack Up Your Sins and Go to the Devil, which some of you I think are nodding your heads and familiar with. So let me tell you a little about this song. It has a fast beat, and it kind of carves out a new musicality from a lot of the slower rhythmic ones. It has a jagged kind of quick beat to it. And the lyrics are, it's about sort of the underworld and how that could be more kind of fun and more kind of interesting, things that you wouldn't necessarily expect from a song in this era. So, somehow take a look at that, but also again, recalling some of that humor. So, okay. So we have to talk about the genre of ragtime. So ragtime, it was invented by Scott Joplin, and it emanated from the Black community. Okay, that's first of all. It had its own sort of definition from Scott Joplin, and he had a ragtime ballet, 2 operas. He was best known for Maple Leaf Rag, although many different rags. But he was never given much credit for it until later, and even after his death. So Berlin was invited to join the Friars Club here in New York with his mentor, George Cohan, born on the 4th of July. And he decides to write a song about it. And the song is Alexander and His Clarinet, okay? And that song eventually would become one of his biggest hits ever, which is Alexander's Ragtime Band. Okay, this song is what put him on the map. Before this song, he wasn't that famous. This was global. It kind of sweeps the world, including his home country of Russia, ironically. I mean, it's kind of interesting. He fled from there, and then we're talking about 1912, and it was a huge hit, and it's played in a lot of films. This is, if you watch Titanic, for example, which I think is 1912, they're playing that song as just one example. So there was, with ragtime, it was the notion of having more of a jagged edge to the music, and it had more of a quick beat. And I'm going to kind of play a song here in a moment from the Andrews Sisters, just so you kind of hear some of the recordings. And I wanted to try to get you older recordings too, not just the new things. Yeah, I can find you videos of new things. I wanted to show you some of the older things. I do have to say that, and this is, I'm going to try to tie it to a lot of contemporary things. You know how there's so much misinformation today and disinformation? I have news for you. That's always been around. There were persistent rumors that he hired a Black pianist to compose the tunes, and that he didn't do any of them himself, and some of them played it for him in secret. And so it wasn't true, but people believed it, and that was a real problem that he had to dispel it. So, okay, let's take a look. Let's take a listen here to this.
Oh my honey, better hurry and let's meander. Ain't you going man, ragged meter man. Oh my honey, let me take you to Alexander's grandstand brass band. Ain't you coming along? Come on in here, come on in here. Alexander's ragtime band. Come on in here, come on in here. It's the best band in the land. They can play a bugle call like you never heard before. So natural that you wanna go to war. That's just the bestest band what am. My honey lamb, come on along, come on along. Let me take you by the hand. Up to the man, up to the man, who's the leader of the band. And if you care to hear that Swanee River played in ragtime, come on in here, come on in here. Alexander's ragtime band. Come on in here.
Okay, so that's just an excerpt for you. Other things to note about that. You hear the syncopated rhythm the Antra sisters are doing. That was very new. Yeah, this was a big revelatory moment in what became mainstream music. Okay. Now, another important point. This was not appreciated by moralists, by pure, more puritanical people. You shouldn't have music like this. It'll instill the wrong values. So he did have some of that, as you might expect. Just in a way like you do today, I think, with a lot of things. So, so let's sort of like talk a little bit about some of his personal life. So he actually met Dorothy Getz, who she kind of like, they met at Tin Pan Alley. She came in and sort of demanded to be able to sing some of his songs, and he thought she was like very assertive and kind of like that. And to make sort of a long story short, they eventually, it was pretty quick, they sort of fell in love and got married. Unfortunately, though, tragedy struck on their honeymoon, and Dorothy died from tuberculosis. At this point, Berlin is pretty famous, and he has a very good income. He tried to hire all these doctors to save her, but they were unable to. So he really became very depressed. I think when we talk about Irving Berlin, there's a lot of the emotionality that we want to really note to. We don't want to just talk about the facts in his life. He struggled with depression, there's no doubt. And he also had things in his life that, of course, made him that way. And so he had some ups and downs. This was a real down for him. But this is also where he took comfort in writing music in some way. So this is where we are going to, he wrote the starter lyrics for Always. Did he write the song Always from this? No, that came later. But he wrote the beginning of it. So we are going to have our instrumentalists whom you met, Gregory Singer and Yelena Rahman, play our song, and you'll hear, and online as well, we'll put the camera there, so you'll be a part of that too, for Always. Great, thank you. Thank you both. So that was very lovely. I'm just waiting for the camera to come back here for our online audience. So now it is World War I, of course, is the United States decided to take part in World War I, and Berlin became a US citizen, so he was also drafted into the army. And there's a whole story that we get into in the book, which we won't get into here, but he's a total misfit for the army. I mean, he's not meant for it. This isn't going to work out. It's like the military, it's regimented. Also, you have to get up early in the army. And he's an insomniac. He worked at the Pelham Cafe and he never got over that. So I think even though it was very much regular civilians who came and there were a lot of entertainers, I think a lot of them looked at him like, who is this guy who's going to be like in the army here? So he really struggled with getting up early in the morning, and he thought of a way out of it. And he met with the general, and the general said, we are trying to raise money so that we can, there's a lot of different programs that we want to enact. So he says, I can put on a show. And also, some of the soldiers here are entertainers, and it'll be natural for them, and we'll teach those that don't. So they produced a show, and the opening night was August 19th, 1918. And it had celebrities who came like Al Jolson, Eddie Cantor, and eventually it moved to the Century Theater in New York. The show was a big hit. Audiences loved the show. It raised the money that they wanted to, and it was kind of like this amazing effort. The show itself had a lot of different elements to it. It had a little vaudeville. I do have to say it had some, elements that would not be appropriate today. But, that was sort of like the art form then. But in the last performance, the soldiers actually marched off to war. When they left the theater, they actually were going to, and yeah, the US wasn't involved that long in World War I, but you didn't know that then. So there was kind of like this despondency that sort of was underneath that at its core. So I'm going to play you something from World War II. So we're skipping ahead just because I want to show you this video, but it's very relevant. Just sort of pretend that it's World War I. Oh, we got to wait.
You gotta get up, you gotta get up, you gotta get up this morning.
Been a soldier quite a while, and I would like to state the life is simply wonderful. The army food is great. I sleep with 97 others in a wooden hut. I love them all, they all love me. It's very lovely, but oh, how I hate to get up in the morning. Oh, how I'd love to remain in bed. For the hardest blow of all is to hear the bugler call. You gotta get up, you gotta get up, you gotta get up this morning. Someday I'm going to murder the bugler. Someday they're going to find him dead. I'll amputate his reveille and step upon it heavily and spend the rest of my life in bed.
Oh, how I hate to get up in the morning. Oh, how I love to remain in bed. For the hardest blow of all is to hear the bugler call. You gotta get up, you gotta get up, you gotta get up this morning. Someday I'm going to murder the bugler. Someday you're going to find him dead.
And then I'll get that other pup, the guy who wakes the bugler up,
and spend the rest of my life in bed.
So as you can see, he's not a good singer. That's not what he did. And it's kind of funny because later in his life, like someone who was on a set for a movie, and we'll talk about that later, was like, when he heard the Berlin sing, not knowing who he was, said, "Oh, the songwriter of that song must be sort of rolling in his grave to hear him sing. So he sang like average, but he had a real knack for taking like everyday kind of experiences and putting that together. We'll talk a little bit more about Cole Porter later, but we think about the Gershwin brothers and Cole Porter and Berlin. People kind of think about those three together. Berlin was the most hard and Scrabble, but it came through in his music, and therefore it was easier for him to sell his songs because a wider group of people were interested in that. They were more relatable. They were also tended to be simpler tunes and simpler lyrics than, let's say, a Cole Porter that had more sophisticated musicality and had more subtlety. But you know what? Cole Porter, he had trouble like going to Broadway and getting some of his shows and songs produced. And so we'll mention a little later about their friendship, but the two kind of were good friends. And Berlin was kind of a mentor for him. And I read a lot of their letters at the Yale University Music Collection. In a way, they were like the yin and the yang because they really kind of offered each other what the other didn't have. So let's talk a little bit about the business behind this, okay? So competition for Tin Pan Alley. The music industry is shifting again, as it always is. Like we're talking about the streaming now and then talking about all these other things that are coming out relative to it. Well, then it was like that. So no longer did customers have to own their pianos to play music. Recorded music at a more mass level provided real competition. People started buying like records at a higher rate than sheet music. And that was very scary to them. Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley, they were afraid of losing customers. And, just kind of for you to think about like, films with TV and broadcast TV to cable and now to streaming. And now streaming is in flux because they overspent on all these productions. So sort of repeats. I have some statistics. You'd be surprised. That song sold 800,000 copies of recorded music, outpacing sheet music sales. That's like a turning point in this industry. Of course, with the advent of radio, you had the whole question of what role should radio play. Some songwriters in Tin Pan Alley objected to radios being able to play it whenever they wanted, and there was and Berlin didn't like it either, by the way. But then he eventually saw that it might actually be a good thing. Okay, so who here has been to the Music Box on Broadway? Yeah, a lot of you guys. Dear Evan Hansen was there recently. So Berlin, he worked on Ziegfeld Follies with Florian Ziegfeld. And this was first of all, he decided he wanted to co-own the Music Box because as a producer, he realized that, so much of the revenue was going to the rent of the theater. So he thought if he could co-own it, he had two people co-own it. And one was sort of a famous producer who put up a lot of the financing. Then they could have that more. A lot of the shows tended to be like more sort of spectacle, like, visually interesting. And, Sam Harris was his co-producer. And so you have A Pretty Girl is Like a Melody, was one of the more famous songs from that. So that's actually important musically. A lot of musicologists note that the verses follow a patter lyric that mimic a lot of classical tunes. And though he was not schooled in music, he self-taught himself classical music. He borrowed a lot from Dvorak's, like Humoresque, Mendelssohn's Spring Song, and some of these rhythmic patterns were used later in films. So that's a little background there. Like I mentioned, he turned to the famed producer Joseph Schenek. You'll see him for a lot of like old films. And he wrote Music Box reviews and hit songs like Say It With Music, which are still performed today. So this is just to give you a little song like Pretty Girls Like a Melody. I know it's old fashioned, but I'm really kind of showing you also like for the musicality of it and why musicologists sort of show this.
You play on the strings of your heart. A pretty girl is like a melody that haunts you night and day. Just like the strain of a
Okay, so so Mary Ellen McKay, we should mention him. We mention her. He became probably one of the most important, obviously, in his life. So she was a socialite from an ultra wealthy family, like I said, the Nevada silver mines, as you see here. And her father was, you know, things back then, especially in the East Coast, was very pedigree oriented. Never mind if he was a successful songwriter, that didn't matter. What mattered is that he wasn't from the right family. It also mattered that he was from a Jewish family. That was not cool with him. And he was dead set against their being together and then eventually their marriage. So what they do is they elope. And he's very famous at this time. So there's all kinds of like paparazzi about it. But the couple kind of survives all that, despite having such strong dissupport from her father. Well, you know, life's a funny thing, right? Things kind of happen. So guess what happened? The stock market crash. And it is said that the father lost more, or almost more than anyone in the whole country, pretty much, from the stock market crash. And he basically went from being one of the richest people in the whole country to basically being wiped out, because he was completely involved in equities. He was tied up in equities. But Berlin actually didn't get hurt that much by the stock market, because his money, while far, far less, was not that much in equities. It was in royalties. And it didn't really affect that as much. And if anything, during the Depression, there was more of an interest in theater and film, as you know, like the golden age of Hollywood in the 1930s. So he gave a loan, or a bailout, basically, to McKay. And, well, lo and behold, his Clarence McKay was kind of like a little more okay with him after that. You know, and this couple ended up staying together until their death. He lived to be very old. Irving Berlin died at age 101. And they lived together, although he did not age well, I do have to say. The last 20 years of his life, both physically and mentally and emotionally, were not great for him or his wife. But they got along really well. And 1 year apart from each other, they died. And he also like helped his mother financially. But and this is where I have to be objective, because, you know, I'm not just here to say he did all these great things. He didn't seem like he helped, as far as I could tell. And I read a lot of different sources. He didn't help his family that much. Like, it was kind of minimal, considering how successful he was. And a lot of them were really like struggling. So I mentioned about the friendship with Cole Porter before. And I mentioned sort of about this yin yang. Just wanted to read you a quick letter, because I want to give you some of that primary research, you know. A letter from Berlin to Cole Porter in 1933, which is from the Yale University Music Collections. I am mad about Night and Day, and I think it is your high spot. You probably know it is being played all over, all the orchestra leaders thinking it is the best tune of the year, and I agree with them. Really, Cole, it is great. I could not resist the temptation of writing you about it. Love from us to you, and Linda. So I thought that was interesting. So now we have to talk about film, okay? So Berlin enters film, and especially when it becomes talkies. So what was the first talkie that kind of changed all that, and what year? What? Yeah, I think 1927, The Jazz Singer. So for those that you didn't hear, The Jazz Singer, 1927, with Al Jolson, with Blue Skies, that sang. Now, so playwright George Kaufman in Berlin, they signed on to write a play for the Marx Brothers. And this was a comedy about South Florida, pretty much at that time, in the mid-1920s. And I do a talk on South Florida, which maybe we'll do here sometime. Basically, it was kind of like a get-rich-quick scheme and a lot of scams, in so many words, in the early to mid-20s. And that's what the play was about. It was sort of a comedy about it. So Berlin was, you know, he had some issues, which we have to bring up, right? We don't just make it like he's, you know, perfect and everything. He was very sensitive about criticisms of his songs. And he kind of got into arguments with people over it. Marx Brothers, they ad-libbed lyrics, because that's what they did. I mean, you can't just tell Groucho Marx to, you know. So they ad-libbed, and also this was one of the first musical comedies on film. So they're like, yeah, that's fine that there's a script, but, you know, I'm Groucho Marx, or I'm the Marx Brothers. I'm gonna improvise a little bit. he was really mad about that, Berlin, and he objected to the parodying of his songs. Talk about an irony. This is someone who became famous from parodying other songs. So it's kind of interesting. But the Coconuts then became a film. It was filmed at Astoria Kaufman Studios when a lot of things were filmed in New York. Then a lot of it went to Los Angeles in Hollywood, and his future films, most of them will be at Paramount Pictures in Hollywood, which I went to and went to the actual sound stages for this, to research this. So who am I talking about here? Oh, very good, wow. Fred Astaire, exactly. And so this is like the film scores. The tide shifted more to escapism and fantasy with the Great Depression. So RKO Studios was the main studio. You know, you'll see that when you watch these films in the beginning. That's located right, it was essentially near Paramount Pictures in downtown, in Hollywood. And they weren't doing well. So sometimes when they're not doing well, they're willing to take more of a chance. And so they took a chance on an unknown actor-dancer, Fred Astaire, and Top Hat in 1935. So this is when they pair Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. They start to have some successful films. And by the time Top Hat comes about, and who can tell me what's the famous song from Top Hat? Cheek to Cheek, yeah, which has been covered, like, I mean, Lady Gaga and, you know, everyone covers that now. And Tony Bennett played that at the Grammys. So basically, like, he negotiated a better financial arrangement, more profit sharing, and also more artistic control. So I want to give you a sense of like what was his negotiating. He checked into the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills for 6 weeks and more, and wrote a lot of these songs, and you know, like Cheek to Cheek. And Astaire was, do you think he was very pleased with the script, and he was very pleased with a lot of the films and fame that he was getting, right? No, he was mad. He basically felt that the script was stereotypical, and he was tired of being typecast, and he wanted more complex characters. So you kind of have these sort of going on at Paramount Pictures as we're talking about that. So several songs from Top Hat made the hit parade, which was, so remember, the hit parade was based on nationwide surveys, on record sales, on band performances, radio plays. Cheek to Cheek was #1 on that list. There was also Follow the Fleet. And he wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band film score. That was not successful. Critics did not like it, and it fared poorly at the box office.
Neither do I. All I know is that it's heaven. I'm in heaven, and my heart beats so that I can hardly speak. And I seem to find the happiness I see when we're out together dancing cheek to cheek. Heaven, I'm in heaven, and the cares that hung around me through the week seem to vanish like a gambler's lucky streak when we're out together dancing cheek to cheek.
You're gonna get that idea. Okay, so let me tell you about God Bless America. So, of course, you're all familiar with it, and he wrote the song in 1918. And here's what I want you to get from this piece is also the bigger picture here, not just the Irving Berlin part. How does a song change its cultural meaning over time? How can that be a positive thing, and how can that be a negative thing? And how can different groups assign a meaning to a song, which the songwriter might never have intended? That's what happened here with God Bless America. So he wrote the song in 1918, and it just goes to show you how the mood can change of the public. And so it was kind of considered too sappy. But he actually wrote it as the lyrics are. Like he really did think that for all its faults, the US was a home for him and his family, and he escaped here. It wasn't all this irony or anything like that. Now, And that was that. It was like, it really was that. And also his mother used to say, God bless America. That was kind of like, you know, in his mind. Well, it languished in his trunk of songs. He literally had a trunk that he kept the songs in. And that was that, not really heard from. Well, the environment changed in the mid-1930s with the onset of World War II. And, you know, the timing seemed right. And there was a lot of emotion in the song, the way the song is written. And so Kate Smith had a booming voice to kind of bring out the emotion of the song. So her radio broadcast was on Armistice Day on November 11th, 1938. That is what made this song what it was. Radio, Kate Smith, the right holiday, and the environment. It was what was going on then. See, 20 years ago, people would be like, oh, that's so like overly sentimental. Now, it resonated with listeners, and there were even calls for it to replace the Star Spangled Banner. So think about, what does that mean? You know, just a larger picture question. What does that mean to have a national anthem? And who decides that? So some did think it should be, because the Star Spangled Banner was only an anthem since 1931. I mean, it's not like it's been an anthem for that long. Some thought that it was like more relevant. So the New York Times said, Americans who find the Star Spangled Banner hard on their voices have found a patriotic song. So you have that. Now, here's the deal. There was a huge backlash to it. You have the left and the right. Both did not like it. Because on the left, they are, you know, like the far left or whatever, they felt like it was overly jingoistic. Like, what do you mean, God bless America? Are you saying that these other countries aren't as valid? That's very ethnocentric. So they didn't like it. You also had a lot of pushback on the far right, probably more. And they said that like a Jewish immigrant really had no right to sing this song, because that's not his place. And there was a lot of like, you know, deep conservative resentments about it. So they played this song, and you know what? There was booing at some of it. And the neo-Nazis did not like the song, but a generation later, it became popular on the right as like America's first song, they called it. But see, here's the thing. Then it changed again, because times changed. And then eventually, when you get to 9/11, 2001, it was played all the time, and it took on a totally different meaning. As if I didn't throw enough at you about the left and the right, I have to throw something else at you. Sorry, over-commercialization. Another thing is you can wear out a song by playing it too much on the radio. That's what happened. DJs played it. And yeah, I mean, you kind of loses its power. So, but there was someone who listened to it, and this person was very annoyed that it was played all the time and felt maybe it was a little bit overly jingoistic. And it kind of spawned something that he would write, which would be one of the most famous songs in this sort of genre. Who am I talking about? And what's the song? Right. Wow, you guys really know your stuff. You're great. Okay. They said, and for everyone online, Woody Guthrie, and This Land Is Your Land. And it's important to note that This Land Is Your Land, it's not like the Peter, Paul, or Mary kind of touchy-feely, sweet. That's not how he read it. It was more about how, as he sort of, you know, walking the land, he's from Oklahoma, a lot of it was closed off. And he felt that like society was very inequitable. It had an edge to it. So also, I invite you to think about how a song changes even like that over time. Because then it became more like a children's song and sweet. No, that is absolutely not how it started. So it's very interesting. And just to think about the cultural symbolism. Okay, and now it's played, of course, at baseball games. So you can think about all this the next time you're at a Mets game. Okay. So I have a question. Where did the song, which you're gonna know because you know everything. But you guys are really good. So the song White Christmas first appeared in Holiday Inn, what year did that come out? 42, yeah, 42 or 43. And at 42, okay. And it was actually filmed in Paramount Pictures in Hollywood, like a lot were. And they have a museum, by the way, in Paramount Pictures of like old costumes, if you're ever in LA. And they have the original costumes and some of the original scripts, which you could see, which is kind of neat. Okay, so Holiday Inn, basically, I have here, like, he recognized the trend of stories about countryside, and Tin Pan Alley was giving way to regional and more homey types of music. So, but he himself was thinking about White Christmas when he was thinking of his home, and he was in Beverly Hills, and he was missing it. And basically, this Holiday Inn, not much interest from studios. They thought it was a little corny, maybe. And also, it was World War II. So it was very complicated in how you would film it and how you would distribute it, but they were still making a lot of films. So, but then Bing Crosby, who was the biggest star, then signed on. They said, oh, okay, well, now we'll do it. And that song, White Christmas, became the best-selling song of all time. And so here we have some famous Irving Berlin films. So, I mentioned here White Christmas, right? So you mentioned Holiday Inn in 1942. Okay, so fast forward to the mid-1950s. Now you have White Christmas, which also has that song and a lot of these actors in it. You also have Call Me Madam, which was very famous as far as, and then that was developed into, a show, and a lot of that was just recently on off Broadway in New York about 4 years ago, which I went to see. And then Annie, Get Your Gun. And you can kind of read about it in the book about Annie, Get Your Gun, but in so many words, he's like, I don't know how to write this score. I don't know about these people from Ohio and this whole mythical West. And he sort of learned that because he was very good at mimicking the dialogue and put that in as well. Do we have time for a live song or no? I'll defer to you. Yeah, okay. So if that's okay, we're just, gonna go a little over. I invite our musicians to play Doing What Comes Naturally from Annie, Get Your Gun. Thank you. That was great. Okay, so we're kind of coming to the end here, but I want you to, there's a few things that we'll sort of wrap up with. So he was very much of a music trendsetter, I think, until he wasn't. And, he kind of eventually fell out of tune with a lot of the music changes that were going on. So you have the advent of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, you have Bill Haley and Rock Around the Clock. And this is a very different sentimentality in the music and also very different structurally in the music. Berlin was getting older now. He wasn't really able to sort of keep up with that. He also was very self-conscious about his work. He struggled with depression, with anxiety, and insomnia. So he tried to do a show in the early 1960s about JFK and ironically, what his life would have been after the presidency. Of course, no one knowing what would happen with that. But and the Kennedy family came to see it. It wasn't successful. It just wasn't successful. And so it made him feel like more self-conscious. Now it's the early 1960s. And, what I would say is that in his last 20 years, he really did not age well. He lived until 101, but very much as a recluse with his wife. They were sort of in self-imposed exile, you might say, in their apartment near the United Nations. And, in the 1970s and 1980s, he also got a reputation for being cantankerous. He wouldn't grant permission for others to use his music, even if they paid. A lot of times, he kind of like got a little bit of a negative reputation and didn't want any like biographies or anything like that for the most part. He died in 1989. They had a big tribute to him in Carnegie Hall in 1988. But see, he didn't come to that. And they offered like a televised, like kind of like the equivalent of Zoom today, in the late 80s. Nope, didn't want that either. So that's just a good example of how he sort of became isolated. So what I would conclude with is that when we talk about scores for film, for theater, he largely remade their image, but in his final decades, he was unable to remake his own. So that's the talk. Let me just do this real quick. And just to let you know, thank you. The website is paulkaplanauthor.com. You can see a lot of the stuff on here. We have 7 books here, some of which we've talked about here. And a lot of them are like related, about the progressive era and Jewish New York and original Penn Station. And we have a business book as well about marketing in museums and so on. So we have all that for sale back then for cash or Venmo or credit card, most people do. And then also, so it's just doing only $13 for the Irving Berlin book. It covers a lot more. It has a lot of historic photos. If you buy 3 books, the 4th one is free. And then for those of you online, we have like an online discount for you. So if you simply go to arcadiapublishing.com, just go to Arcadia Publishing. That's the easiest thing. Put in the search term Irving Berlin, and you'll see the discount price that we have for you today. And it takes like 2 minutes to set up your account. It's very easy. So just go ahead and do that. And that's that.
Paul, that was absolutely fantastic. Not just about Irving Berlin, but the way you put music in a societal context. It was really fascinating. It was a terrific talk. I'm going to say more at the end, but I'm going to take some questions, and I want to remind the audience both here and of course are online. If you would like to type in questions, our colleague Meg will then forward those questions. And I see a hand up there, so I'm going to head over for the first question. Well, because it's being recorded.
Hi. So tell us more about that, what I would call prepared piano. I know something about it, but I think we'd all like to hear about the kind of piano that he used to shift the key up or down.
Right.
Okay, could you address that?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was actually popular in Europe before here. And he was sort of looking for a way to be able to play other keys because he couldn't. So there was like a device that you would put on the bottom of the piano, and that device would kind of like allow you to play. It would make it sound like you're playing a lot more than just the black keys. It was almost kind of like an illusion in a way. And you could shift it accordingly in terms of like which notes you wanted to hit. So it was kind of like the Cliff Notes version. It was kind of illusory. And it was a little bit like secret in a way, because you wouldn't necessarily see it if you were watching it because it was underneath the piano. But it was that like trick was kind of a big deal because it allowed him to widen a lot of what he was able to play. And I think it just gave him more confidence. So he used that. And then if you're wondering also, this is tangential to your question, like how did all this music get written if he didn't ever study musical education? The answer is musical secretary. He would have a tune in his head. you know, in those days, there was more like musical secretaries who were excellent at transposing it. And he would sort of just tune, and they would be able to put that into actual note form. And that's what would become of it, like a Tin Pan Alley or other musical secretaries as well.
From your research, what most surprised you in all that you read and learned?
What most surprised me, I'd say a few things. I mean, number one, and I've said this many times, but it's really surprising. And this is true for a lot of people who become very famous. He didn't have the musical education. I mean, like nothing. And he dropped out of school, like in middle school. You know, like with Walt Whitman, for example, who became one of the great poets who had very little education in that. So just how amazingly, you know, intuitive that was. I was surprised by how much pushback God Bless America had when I was researching that. I mean, I'm not surprised that it was over commercialized, but I was surprised that, like, on both sides, how much the song's like meaning changed over time. I would say those are the two things that surprised me most. Thank you.
Right, before I go to the next question for our in-person audience, I just have a few comments from online I'd like to share with you. This one's wonderful. This is from Peter Tannen. My dad worked for Irving Berlin for 15 years and became his sales manager. In September 15th, 1942 memo to my dad about White Christmas, he wrote, "I always knew this song is a natural. And I think this song can easily be what God Bless America was." Isn't that great?
Wow.
Yes.
I have two questions, but I think they'll be short answers. Tin Pan Alley, you said it was because of the clanging of the tin pans. Why did that happen? What was that clanging of?
So, and there's different theories about why that became the name. It was like kind of the nickname, Tin Pan Alley, but it sounded like it was tin pans banging. In reality, it was the piano players who were like cranking out tunes and like dun dun dun, and you know, trying different things. But if you walk by, it might feel to you or sound to you like it was tins.
Okay, and the next one is just in the blurb up here, you had Irving Berlin and Cole Porter were two of the only songwriters who actually wrote their songs. Who wrote? Who wrote their lyrics? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, I misread that.
Sure.
This is just another comment from online. Blue Skies, this is from, I should say, this is from Alfred Robert Hogan. Blue Skies, you did mention its first appearance in film, but also to mention it was used early in White Christmas. And he also comments, now I appreciate how many songs Irving Berlin generated, but he did want to mention Easter Parade because he did think that was an important song in the Irving Berlin, what's the word? Songbook. Thank you, in the songbook, exactly. Right. So he did want to mention that.
Right.
Okay.
And just to say, Irving, very quickly, Easter Parade, you know, also was a film with Judy Garland, and so the song was used there, and a big part of that too. Right.
Okay, I'm going to take just another question from online. Did Irving Berlin, once successful, ever return to Russia, as the pianist Vladimir Horowitz famously did in 1986?
Not to my knowledge. And I think this speaks to, and I could be wrong, but I did not see anything of that. So I think for Berlin, you know, first of all, he left when he was 5. So that, and also he didn't have that much connection with it. Even when he was interviewed, like as an older adult about it, he had some memory, a little bit of memories, but it was something that was a little bit distant for him. So it doesn't, even putting the logistics aside and the travel there, it didn't seem like it was something terribly important. If he did, and I'm wrong, it didn't, when you read some of his memoirs and diary, it wasn't like a huge thing for him.
I think we had another question.
When did he decide to go back from
Berlin to Baline, and what happened that made him feel comfortable doing so?
Well, he was Israel Baline, and then he changed his name to Irving Berlin, which was more commercially successful. He pretty much stuck with that name. He didn't go back to becoming Israel Baline like as a commercial artist, as known in the public. Once he switched, and he did change it in his birth certificate, that was it. I mean, maybe his family called him something else, but he then always became Irving Berlin. I didn't see anything from later years where he was Israel Baline. And I don't think he would, I think his agents would frown upon that because, I mean, also, then he established a name for himself. So then it becomes sort of confusing. And then if you change your name, there's sort of a branding issue with that, if you like.
Okay, an online question. What was Irving Berlin's reaction to Taco's synth pop version of Putting on the Ritz? And that's from Shalom Stavesky.
That's a good question. So Put It on the Ritz was what film did Put It on the Ritz originally come from? What's that? Idiot's Delight. It was also in a film in the late 20s or early 30s called Put It on the Ritz, or I think, which I watched. And that song, it has different lyrics than the one that you know. The original song was about Lenox Avenue in Harlem, okay? And also, like, let's just kind of call it for what it is, okay? It was a racist song. I mean, it wasn't any more than a lot of what was happening, but it was. And, you know, if you listen to that song carefully in that film, in the late 1920s film, not a later film, that's what you'll hear. It was about Black residents in Harlem, in Lenox Avenue in Harlem, and it had a mocking tone to it. Then he changed the lyrics, and it became more about like Fifth Avenue and, you know, all these like rich, glamorous people. And then many decades later, Taco actually changed it. I think that Berlin didn't like that because not so much the lyrics and everything I said, because he was pretty much the same lyrics as what he has. But he really objected to like any type of, and this is not one of his better qualities, you know? He objected to most artists using it or kind of taking a cover to it, changing the tune to it a little bit. So I think he was displeased.
Okay, well, I'm just going to take, did you spoke, right?
No.
Oh, sorry, I'm so sorry. Oh, that's okay.
40 years ago, the composer John Wallowich began a tradition of every Christmas Eve at 6 o'clock going to Berlin's house and singing White Christmas. And that continued for a very long time. One year, the door opened and we all met Berlin.
Wow.
The tradition fell out of favor for a few years after John died, but it's been revived. So if any of you are free on Christmas Eve at 6 o'clock, come to 17 Beekman Place. It only takes 15 minutes, 12 if it's very cold. And it's now the Luxembourg consulate.
Great comment. Wow, great comment. That's right. Right, fantastic. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm so glad you were able to ask that question. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to take a couple more questions, and I did see over here.
Paul, thank you so much. And my question is, I know you say your books are related, but why did you choose Irving Berlin as a subject?
I thought it was an interesting subject. So one of the first books that I wrote was on Jewish New York. And in that talk, I go into different personages. And then I thought it'd be interesting to write like more in depth about someone. Some of what I thought was interesting was that he had no musical education. It was an interesting kind of play with this. He is a commercial songwriter. And looking at that, I thought was interesting. But even though he was a commercial songwriter, he ended up being so culturally influential. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of blend there. I thought it was just a good opportunity also to talk about, how changes in musical style can work for you or work against you. And it sort of worked for him for a long time. He had a very good run until it didn't. And I just think, I thought there were other interesting elements to the story too. I mean, it's also a story about a little bit about aging, just because he lived so long, to 101. So, you know, there are questions about that, and what does that mean to age and to be physically and mentally fit or not? And just the notion of parody, and because he slapped some lawsuits on like Mad Magazine, who, you know, parodied some of it. And while some of them were thrown out in court, you know, it's a lot of money to do that. So it's an interesting question about, you know, where do you let other artists or humor magazines or not? And kind of where do you kind of draw those lines? So I thought that those were all interesting.
Well, you were mentioning and putting on the Ritz and the black reference to Lenox Avenue, right. But every Jewish songwriter of that period was from Harlem. Right. Richard Rodgers, Oscar Hammerstein, Lorenz Hart, you know, and so they would have witnessed blacks having great pride, particularly after the First World War and Harlem's taking off, that they would see it and comment on it, not necessarily see it as derogatory.
Right. I'd say yes and no. So absolutely, Harlem was a big area for Jews in like from 1880 to around 1920. And that is true that some, you know, kind of witnessed that. But when you look at the lyrics of the song and some of the subtext of the song and some different like musicologists who've written about that, the original lyrics, not what it became a few years after, I think that there is, it's sort of like both, but I think that a case can be made for some, and that's partly why he changed the lyrics too, I think. So I think I agree, but I disagree slightly in how the song was written.
Right, we're going to take two more questions. I'm going to come over to you, sir, and I'm going to paraphrase an online question we got. This is from Christina Tari. It sounds like Irving Berlin was quite business savvy. Was this unusual for like a singer-songwriter for it to be so on the ball financially?
That's an interesting question. He was business savvy because and I was kind of telling you, like in contrast to Cole Porter and the Gershwin brothers, who were a little bit more, I don't know, almost academic, if you like, maybe not academic, but like more in, you know, Yale education with Cole Porter. He was more sort of a hardscrabble kind of person. And he was more about like, you know, he was naturally more business savvy. I would say that it's kind of like movie making today, that some are very into, you know, producing the films that are going to do well at the box office, and then other artists, you know, less so, and it's more independent. So I think the answer to this person's question is there's some that were more commercial songwriters and were more business savvy. There were others who didn't care about that stuff that much, and they were more about social change. Well, like Woody Guthrie is one example, but others whose names you don't know, I mean, who aren't famous. And it was, you know, how songs can make social change, how they could be part of like different movements was important. And then others, I'd say there's sort of like another important category, which is more artistically experimenting with different things. So I think for Berlin, he was more commercial, but the irony is he ended up being the ragtime king, you know, almost by accident. So you actually ended up which eventually in some ways led to jazz. I mean, a little bit, among many factors. So, you know, it's sort of like a blended kind of thing. So I would say some songwriters were, but a lot weren't. But the buyers, the Tin Pan Alley, they were very like kind of hardscrabble. Oh, that song's not going to sell. And this tune, it was a little bit more like formulaic kind of, you know, what they were trying to do.
Yeah, I don't really find it that strange that he had a little musical aid, because all the great guitarists had effects pedals, and a lot of them weren't formally musically trained. And you know, they all use wah-wah pedals and distortion. So it's pretty common, or at least later it was, maybe not at his time.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll say yes and no, if I may. Yes, absolutely. Different musicians use different things, and that continues today. When you look at, you know, there's going to be things in the next 20 years about this, about, you know, different computers writing songs. But I do think one difference is some of like the later musicians that you're indirectly referencing, but they do have more of a musical education. While they use technology to help them, they have, I would say, more of a background in music, a lot of them. They are able to play more things even without those. And those are more like enhancements. I mean, for him, it was like really limited. Like he could only play like a small fraction of it all. So I would disagree a little bit on that.
Okay, well, and just to conclude, we just had an online, last-minute online question. And what time is the Beatman sing-along on Christmas Eve? Could you repeat the time? Okay, to our online audience, it's 6 o'clock on the dot. Right. It now comes, Paul, that was just so terrific. Really, what a fabulous overview. But we are so appreciative of the amount of research, your preparation, those wonderful iconic songs you included. And of course, when we're talking about music, I do want to mention that, of course, our wonderful and fabulous live performers, Gregory Singer, violinist, and of course, our pianist, Yelena Ragtime. And so thank you both so much. Because you really provided an added dimension, and we're very grateful to you, as we are to Paul for sharing his incredible expertise on Irving Berlin. So, but to say, I do want to mention one thing. We have two behind-the-scenes people, Meg Oliver and Angelo Vigorito, and I know this, because of the live component of music, this was also, let's say, a more complicated evening. So I want to express our great thanks to Angelo Vigorito.
And just to add to Karen's comments, Paul, thank you for coming back again, for yet the third time. And you're always so generous with us. So that was just fabulous. Thank you, as always. And I want to say to Gregory and Elena, thank you. Often we say when we do a lot of lectures here on architecture, and we always say, where would no architect's vision would be possible or executed without, great tradesmen. And I was thinking about our, musicians here tonight, and that you're the ones who bring things back to life. And I know it might be a thought that others share, but I was thinking of it especially tonight. And Gregory, you're always so generous to us. So thank you for coming back again. And for those of you who don't know Gregory, he's the conductor for the Manhattan Symphony Orchestra. And I'm sure he has many fans here who have heard him before.
And we're all New Yorkers here. It's great society and wonderful building. So it's lovely talk and the contribution of the evolution of a Jewish immigrant to America, story of immigration, etc. So we're all happy to be here, I guess, huh?
Yes, thank you. So speaking of which, I know you can't pick a favorite audience, but I have to say I especially love tonight's audience. Really,
Yeah.
It's you could feel it in the room,
Yeah.
and especially, I don't know who you are, but if there's some quiz show, you're gonna hit big. And to conclude, I must say, God bless America, land that I love. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.
And finally, well, almost finally, I do want to make a presentation to Paul, his poster. He's added to his collection now of General Society posters with Paul Kaplan. So anyway, thank you so much, Paul. Yeah. Right. And I do also want to mention that this wonderful book, Irving Berlin, as long as other books by Paul, is for sale tonight at the back of the room, and I hope you'll join us for a glass of wine. I also want to mention, because there are, a number of really vital people to the General Society here this evening. And I do want to mention, and perhaps he would also stand up when I mention his name, is our new General Society President, Jim Holohan.
Oh.
Thank you. And we are truly going to conclude this lecture now, but I do want to mention on a rather different topic our next lecture, which will be the history of linoleum with Christina Day on Tuesday, March 21st. So Paul, our profuse thanks again for such a wonderful presentation. Please all join us for a glass of wine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.